Okay, hi everybody, welcome to the 10th Levitum Knot. This time we were entering the literary section. Lavanya, who's probably the biggest literature buff in our group here, will be talking about Geoff Dyer. I know she's got tons to say. She's been following him for a while, and also has a blog dedicated completely to Geoff Dyer. And I think it took a little bit of arm twisting for me to get her to talk about this. But I think it's something we'll all enjoy. Lavanya, want to go from here?
Hi everyone, morning. It took a lot of arm twisting, some gentle prodding and all of that, because I think it's sort of fairly embarrassing to talk about a particular author, and you don't know if you're going to end up gushing and be this horrible return to teen type fan. So it's kind of a very tricky ground to tread. So I was a little hesitant, and I felt I can't go on talking about somebody for an hour or something like that. But so I'm going to keep this, at least I'm going to attempt to keep this short and not digress too much. So Geoff Dyer is in recent times he's become very, very popular, and I'm sure even if you haven't read Geoff Dyer, a lot of you would have heard his name and probably come across some of his writings in the New York Times or the Guardian or someplace. And so Geoff Dyer is a British author and lives in California, in Venice, LA currently. And so he was born in the late 50s and in a working class Britain. Now that's crucial because according to Geoff Dyer, he says his whole working class background is what sort of defined how he thinks, what he writes, and how he looks at life and so on. So he was born in Cheltenham, in Britain, in England, and went through a working class childhood, lived in a working class background. His dad was a sheet metal worker. His mom, I think, worked in the school cafeteria. And so he went to grammar school. And he says, somewhere around, he was, in his own words, he said, in an entirely passive way, all I had to do was just keep passing exams. And then the welfare state of Britain, took care of the rest. So he just kept passing exams, did reasonably well to get a scholarship into Oxford, where he studied literature. And he says he never went to classes and, just hung around and read books. And he has this very, very deceptively informal way of brushing aside any ounce of seriousness in his life, and he makes it seem like he's just lounged about his entire life and and is some sort of a loser in some sense. So he's got this very nice persona that he's created of himself, but he's a fairly serious guy. I mean, so he did well at Oxford and then did a whole bunch of jobs and was for quite some time on the dole, which the welfare state of Britain was paying out to people who could not retain jobs and needed welfare money in order to buy sustenance, items for sustenance. So during that time, Geoff Dyer started writing a lot of criticism, literary criticism, and while he was writing literary criticism, he was also reading a lot of books, and he came across, which probably a particular person whose influence has been very, very massive in his whole literary career, the writer John Berger. Now, John Berger is known for writing about various things. He was in the 1970s. There was this very, very popular British series called Ways of Seeing, where John Berger went and spoke about how we look at ads and how we look at paintings and how our ways of seeing sort of influence what we perceive and how we absorb visual input. That was a very popular series, and John Berger was a major influence on Geoff Dyer. So he read a lot of John Berger, and his first book was on John Berger called Ways of Telling. Geoff Dyer now brushes off Ways of Telling as one of those awfully bad books that's thankfully out of print and so on. So I haven't read Ways of Telling, but that's how Geoff Dyer got into writing books. The thing about Geoff Dyer is, you could say, he's a fiction writer, partly true. You could say he's an essayist, also partly true. And then you could say something like, he's a critic, also true. He does not write fiction or non-fiction, and in fact, he manages to beautifully tread the ground between what's fictional, what's memoir. He puts in a lot of personal experience, into his books. So let us say he's writing about photography. He's not just writing about photography. He's also writing about himself as a viewer of photographs. And he's also writing about time and place and memory and all these various interleaving elements that all form a part of the experience of viewing something or enjoying something. So all of his books are a complete mix of things. They're part fiction, they're part non-fiction, and they're part serious meditations on whichever subject matter that he is writing about. So I will share my screen now, and I will use Geoff Dyer's website as a background to quickly run through some of his works. Now, in our gang here, right, there's quite a mix of interests. Some of you love photography, and some of you read fiction, and a lot of you listen to jazz, I think. So there's a great mix of books from Geoff Dyer. For somebody like Vishnu or Aditya, or even the rest of you, right, I would recommend The Ongoing Moment, which is a beautiful meditation on photography. What Geoff Dyer does is he looks at a lot of famous photographs and shares his experiences and also some insights, and also traces through the history of photography, covers the bios of some famous photographers, Diane Arbus, for example, or Winogrand, or people like that. And there are beautiful meditations on all these people, covers their important works, and it is a very, very backdoor kind of way to get introduced to appreciating photography. If not, there are some technical elements that he goes into, but it's largely absorbing something and then learning along the way. Geoff Dyer has also written books on the World War, and his most recent book is on life aboard the USS George Bush, which is called Another Great Day at Sea, and that is his latest release. He, in 2012, wrote a book called Zona, which is about, for the film buffs, right, Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, a very, very a cult film. So he wrote Zona. The entire book is about the film, but it's also about a lot of things, like his other books. I started reading Geoff Dyer in 2010, and I came to Geoff Dyer by way of, this is John Berger, Ways of Telling, and the man in the picture is John Berger. So I came to read Geoff Dyer via John Berger. So the year was 2010, and I was reading this huge bio of D.H. Lawrence by Brenda Maddox, and it was a huge biography, and it covered various elements of D.H. Lawrence's life. It was a fascinating biography. I spent a lot of time reading it, and as used to be my practice when I was trying to read something really absorbing, I would go look up references. So if the author made references to various things, I would go look them up on the web, try and read related material and so on. So one of her, I think her bibliography had a reference to Geoff Dyer, because Geoff Dyer has written a book about D.H. Lawrence called Out of Sheer Rage that you can see on the screen here. And so I went and looked up Out of Sheer Rage next. And then I figured it sounded like an interesting book, and while I was trying to read about Lawrence, I thought it would be good to read this book on Lawrence as well. So I marked Out of Sheer Rage to read. Now, parallelly, while I was reading D.H. Lawrence, a friend of mine had gifted Ways of Seeing by John Berger, and I had thoroughly enjoyed the book. And I was also trying to look up and get acquainted with more of John Berger's works. So I was looking up works of John Berger, and I came across his collection of essays, which Geoff Dyer had written the introduction for. So this seemed to be a happy coincidence. So here I was reading D.H. Lawrence, and by way of bibliography had come to a book by Geoff Dyer. And in a completely different direction from John Berger, I had again landed at this person called Geoff Dyer. So it seemed like a very happy coincidence to me, and I figured I should start reading Out of Sheer Rage. Now, Out of Sheer Rage is an utterly frustrating book for the first 60, 70 pages. He digresses and, in fact, whines a lot about how difficult and impossible it is to write a book about D.H. Lawrence. So there is this whole looping, whining thing, and it was very, very frustrating to go past the first 50, 60 pages. And I kept thinking, now, this was the guy who wrote the introduction to John Berger, and that was a very interesting introduction. Now, why is he going on like this? This is so frustrating. So part of my urge at that time was to just fling the book away and go on. But I felt that I should persist for a little longer. And over a period of time, through that book, I figured that he was creating this persona of somebody trying to write a book about someone else, of the frustrations involved in such an enterprise, and also trying to document the whole perambulations that D.H. Lawrence did throughout his entire life. There were so many things, so many threads going on. And as I traversed through Out of Sheer Age, I started realizing that, okay, this author is trying out this tone of voice, is trying to do something here, not whining, but also trying to let us see that a certain way of looking at a subject matter is possible. And after Out of Sheer Age, I think I took up one of his essay collections, Anglo-English Attitudes. Now, Dyer writes a lot of essays, and I know, in fact, all of you love travel, and Geoff Dyer has written quite a few travel essays. I would strongly recommend Yoga for people who can't be bothered to do it. It's a collection of travel essays, very funny, hilarious almost, and so Geoff Dyer, in his 20s, 30s, and probably even in his 40s, was hugely into recreational drugs. And so there are many wonderful essays in Yoga for people who can't be bothered to do it, where he talks about, being high and of seeing a lot of things that happen around him from that highness, for example. And there is a certain mock pompous tone that he adopts, which is hilarious. Once you get past the fact that this guy is not being pompous, but it's a mock pompousness, his essays are hilarious. And you sort of get accustomed to this persona of Geoff Dyer, and he becomes this sort of friendly, this kind of friend that, you'd love to meet on a Friday night or over the weekend and have a long chat with. He seems very informal, and you don't realize how much of insight or a certain depth of thought he brings into his writings. But after you read his work and you are going about your business, pottering around in your own life, some insights come back to you. For example, one of the things was, now Geoff Dyer is an only child, and I remember reading, so there's an essay called On Being an Only Child in one of his essay collections. I think it's Working the Room. And it was a nice essay to read, and it was funny. It spoke about what a boring childhood he had and things like that. And I was able to appreciate parts of it, and that was that. But then months later, I was talking to somebody about how it was very difficult for me to lie. And it took me a long time to realize that I couldn't lie easily, because as I was trying to say a lie, the words would sort of clog up in my mouth. And a remark from Geoff Dyer's essay came back to me, where he said, if you're an only child, you learn to lie very late because you don't have a sibling whom you can emulate and, quickly scheme up and gang up against your parents. So this whole antagonism against your parents, it sort of evolves very late in your life just because you're an only child. And I thought, wow, that's a brilliant insight. And it hadn't occurred to me, or I wasn't able to appreciate it when I was reading the book, but it sort of came back to me months later. So that's the kind of sly way that Geoff Dyer can sort of get into your consciousness. And he's great company. I mean, his books are great company. You don't really feel bogged or clogged by academic seriousness in his books, but his books are very, very serious meditations on a lot of subjects. Recently, a lot of his books have been published in the US. For example, the book called The Search, which is a short fiction, noirish fiction, was out of print for quite a while, and it looks like it's been republished now. A lot of interesting fiction works of his, I will point out the fiction now. For example, The Color of Memory. Now, he's mined a lot of his personal experience into his fiction. The Color of Memory, for example, is about living on the dole in Brighton in the 1980s. Now, that's his own life, and yet he manages to fictionalize it, manages to not be very forthcoming and forthcoming at the same time. But it's a very insightful piece of fiction where you get a pretty good idea of Brighton and how it is to live on the dole and what sort of associations and friendships you form in your 20s, and how they sort of carry you on through your life. Paris Trance again is another fiction where Geoff Dyer spent some time, I guess a year or two in Paris, and he again fictionalizes his experiences in Paris in Paris Trance. His most recent fiction is Jeff in Venice, Death in Varanasi. This is a two-part novel, so there are like two novellas in the novel. There's a Venice portion and a Varanasi portion, and there are resonances of many different elements in both the novellas. They're like a twin. They're twin pieces, and very, very enjoyable to read. The interesting thing about reading somebody like Geoff Dyer is somebody who likes to read just casual pieces, for example, can find something in Geoff Dyer's works. Somebody who just wants to read some fiction to pass the time can pick up a Paris Trance or a Color of Memory and just read it for the storyline, you know. Like Geoff Dyer says, he says, I suck at fiction, you know, I work with a lot of limitations. All I can probably write in fiction is about a group of friends and, you know, a boy meets girl kind of story. And so there's that. So somebody can casually pick up one of Geoff Dyer's novels, read it from cover to cover over a weekend, and still be perfectly content with having passed their time. And somebody else can actually go back and keep rereading his essays or works on photography or film and pick up something interesting every time they read it. So there I told you, right? I've started gushing. So let me talk a little bit about But Beautiful now that I'm gushing. Now, But Beautiful is a phenomenal book on jazz. In fact, it is a genre-defining book. Now, it is part criticism. It is part history of jazz, part life stories of famous jazz musicians, and it is just woven together so beautifully. There is one track of the story where you have Duke Ellington going about in a battered car across various states in the US and trying to perform night after night in some place to make money. That's one thread of the story. And Geoff Dyer juxtaposes it with bios of many other famous jazz musicians, Thelonious Monk and, you know, so many of them, Ella Fitzgerald and so many of them. And there's so many beautiful meditations on jazz as a form of music, the lives of these musicians, and he addresses them through the consciousness of the musicians themselves. So if he's writing about Thelonious Monk, we are inside the head of Thelonious Monk. And I found it I think that was the book that actually made me feel like here's a writer that I can completely relate to and admire, and probably would want to collect all his books and keep rereading them all the time. So But Beautiful was that kind of a book for me. And it was after But Beautiful that I started collecting Geoff Dyer's works, and also reading every single work of his that comes out, including the essays that come out. Also, you know, trawling the web, trying to see where he's spoken about what, and trying to sort of build a collection for myself. So, so I'm now going to share a little bit about this Tumblr blog that I have. I think I created it like about 3 years ago, where I was finding it increasingly difficult to keep track of various interesting interviews and articles of Geoff Dyer on the web. So I felt, all right, let me just put it somewhere, and I can keep looking at it whenever I want to. And I do reread them once in a while, and it's a nice collection. It's built purely for myself. And I would recommend, if you do have the time and the interest, to go through bits and pieces of this. It's a pretty interesting collection of various things. For example, there is something called The Quiet Carriage, where he talks about consideration and the utter lack of silence in trains. And it is a hilarious, at the same time, a very, very valid piece on, you know, noise and disturbance and interruptions. So here's on being an only child that I mentioned just a little while ago. So there are meditations on art, There's something on sculpture. There's something about punctuality and all sorts of things. There are things about books, and he's hilarious. So if he's never, even when he talks seriously, he doesn't sound serious. Defining our idea of being stuffy and serious. So he's never that serious. He's fun to listen to. And in July, a few weeks ago, in fact, Geoff Dyer has become so popular and so so widely read by other people, that there was even a Geoff Dyer conference a few weeks ago, and I was trying to follow it. Yeah,
Seriously?
Seriously, I would look up the link and share it with you if I could. But I was following these guys. I mean, I heard about them a few months ago, and let me just stop sharing my screen, and then you can probably see me. Yeah, so seriously, and I heard about it a few months ago, and somebody was pinging me on Twitter, and I heard about this conference, and I started following them. It's called The Color of Memory, in tribute of his first book. But there was an entire conference a few weeks ago, and I think Geoff Dyer went and gave a keynote or something like that, and I'm sure he was. So I wanted to see the videos. They're not up yet. So one of these guys told me, a podcast is going to come out soon, so we'll share a link or something like that. But yeah, I mean, he's become popular simply because there's a certain way of addressing life itself, any subject. And he's got a certain sense of curiosity. That's all he has. He has a certain sense of curiosity, a relentlessness to go after any subject that catches his fancy, and then he writes about it. And I like that spirit of addressing something that you don't know, something that catches your fancy, and you just go out there, unhesitatingly go out there and dig into things, and acknowledging that you don't know, but you can. And each of his books are, they show you that. They managed to, yeah. Right, and two of his articles that you've read, right?
Yeah, so just share a couple of links. Yeah, interestingly, he's a tennis player and a tennis fan too. He's moved apparently to California, right? But two articles that he's written, one about Federer and Murray, and another one about just the whole crowd in the royal box and having to bow to the, it's interesting. His style is just so unique. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, initially I think, once I started reading all of his works, right, the gushing extended to sort of marketing him to people I would talk to, right? So every now and then somebody says, okay, what are you reading? And then I would like, have you heard of Geoff Dyer? And then I would go on this whole narrative of, have you read this? Have you read that? Oh, he plays tennis, by the way. So he's written about tennis, and I'm sure I've unleashed that on you in the past. So so it's not just tennis, right? He plays a lot of interesting, he writes about a lot of interesting things. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I guess what I was going to say was, in fact, recently had a stroke after moving to California in February, and there is this guy sitting in the hospital trying to recover from a mild stroke and writing about it. And also mocking himself. There's so much of self-deprecation in his writing. And but there's one thing, right? Somebody who reads Geoff Dyer for the first time and the second time, there's an element of frustration that he brings out in you. I mean, he sort of digresses and goes on these rambles, and you're like, what are you trying to do? And over a period of time, he sort of builds the narrative and then offers a very interesting take. And once you get accustomed to his persona that is on paper, he's a very, very interesting writer to read.
That's a pretty cool introduction.
Yeah.
And I think depending on people's interests, right, there's again a wide range of things that he's written about, and it's like if it's jazz music that someone has an interest in, you can pick up So Beautiful, right? Is that the name of the book?
Yeah, but beautiful. Yeah.
Beautiful. And so are there certain things that you think, I know he's written a number of different things, but if you were to characterize his style, is it something that you could describe, or is it just so diverse that it would be hard to do that?
No, in fact, the style is rather unique. I think that's when somebody says something. So there's something like, I guess you could call it the art of Geoff Dyer, for example. He's got a certain, now he builds a certain persona of this lounging, procrastinating, guy who talks about wasting time, who talks about never getting anything done. So there's that sort of a persona that he's created. And this guy who goes on these digressions. So no matter what he writes about, there are digressions in any piece that he writes. So he's created that persona of this pompous, informal, whining, procrastinating guy, which is an alter ego of himself, part fictional and, part of his characteristics exaggerated to a great extent. That persona is fairly consistent in a lot of his writing, be it essays or, be it his fiction, non-fiction works. That's a consistent persona that one sees. But he can some of his criticism and some of his recent works on essays in The Guardian and, in fact, even his tennis writings, for example, that's just pure admiration and criticism and, a pure essay. There's not so much of his persona taking front stage. But that's the thing. He brings a tone of informality. He loads the academic seriousness that came from, that there was a certain school of thought where, if you were writing serious works of fiction, you had to sort of sound serious. If you were writing serious essays, if you were writing about serious topics, you had to sound suitably stuffy, for example. So he sort of breaks that mold. He's hilarious, and even if you're not at all interested in the books that he's talking about, or not at all interested in the sculpture or the painting that he's talking about, you can still be very interested in reading what he has to say about things, because he says many things, even when he's focusing on a single subject. So it's fun. It's fun.
And what's amazing to me is, I think this is a great introduction, right? Just amazed, Lavanya, how lucid and articulate you've been, just expressing yourself in so many different ways about this. It's clearly a topic you're so passionate about. You've researched it, and I think we're fortunate to hear this from you with such a wonderful outline. So I've really enjoyed this session.
Thanks, guys, and I hope, or maybe I'll just unleash specific essays on each of you and then ask you if you read it or something like that. I've already done this on you, RB, and I think I've done it on Aditya as well. I remember sending him some photography essay that Dyer had written some time ago, years ago. So yeah, I think I'll do it on the rest of you as well.
I look forward to that, I think.
Yeah, me too. The non-fiction ones I can pick up pretty quickly and read. So harder for me to set apart time for fiction. But.
Right. I think the essays are a lot of fun because they give a good flavor, and some of them are just a couple of pages and you can breeze through them. Yeah. But I guess one of the books that I would recommend for somebody who's, let's say, just out there and has no introduction to Dyer but just wants to read, I would recommend Yoga for people who can't be bothered to do it. Very, very interesting collection. It's travel, right? So it's about places, and it's a lot of interesting observations. So that's the book that I would recommend.
So I saw that he's a fan of Kamo. Saw that that you shared.
Yeah.
Is that the style, existentialism?
I think he was a strong influence in his probably his late teens, early 20s. I think that's when he must have picked up reading Camus, and he's written quite a bit. In fact, there was a centennial edition, I think last year or something, was Camus' centenary, and there were some editions coming out, and Dyer wrote an introduction to quite a few of Camus' books. He's very erudite on Camus, in fact, without seeming to be so. Yeah. And he also has written quite a few essays on Camus, right? And he captures these whole Algerian summers and the Algerian sunlight, and that whole sense of visiting Algeria almost on a pilgrimage, just because, he goes to the street and tries to locate the house where Camus lived in as a child with his mom. And so there's that literary pilgrimage that he does and writes about. So he's very, very erudite on Camus. Yeah. He's also got a lot of interest in India. So a lot of his essays, he's got interest in Hindustani and Carnatic music. So there are some essays which talk about that. His essay collections are pretty good places to pick up, to just flip through and read interesting stuff about a pretty eclectic. There's
Geoff
this
Dyer?
very beautiful essay on donuts, for example. It's called, otherwise known as the human condition. So
Oh.
it's about trying to get his perfect donut, and how some donuts suck, certain brand donuts don't, and what does he look for in a donut. So good fun.
And Geoff Dyer, if by some accident you happen to be watching this video, you know how to reach Lavanya. She's at Just Bits.
I wish you well. If you're hearing this, write more. That'll do.
Cool. Thanks, Lavanya. And
Thanks, everyone. I hope it wasn't too obscure.
Thanks, Lavanya. Sounds
It really-
interesting. I'll look up on some links that you said. Yeah.
It's definitely interesting. Not obscure at all.
right, guys. Catch you
Right.
soon.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you. Catch you
Bye.
later. Bye-bye.